Welcome, and thanks for viewing our Creating Lessons demo. This demo provides a quick overview of what is involved in creating lessons for Language Mentor. It's not intended to be a complete how-to, rather to give you a sense of what's involved. If you decide that you'd like to know more, we go into a fair amount of detail in the articles in the Creating Lessons section of our website. Most lessons begin with a script. We'll create an extremely simple lesson here, one which simply teaches the user how to say, "Hi, how are you?" and "Very well, thanks," in Chinese. Of course, real lessons will be longer, but we want to keep this demo as simple as possible. Note that it has a header, role lines, and 2 chunks. Let's look at the header first. It contains the author's name, the lesson's name, and some IDs. Let's start with a provider ID. This is a unique identifier for your organization, or if you are an individual, for yourself. You should use a reverse domain name for this, based on an internet domain that you own. This will ensure that this ID is unique to you. For example, if you own mydomain.com, you could use com.mydomain. Or perhaps you need to be more specific. Perhaps the entity that is creating the lessons is a department within a larger organization. In that case, you could use com.mydomain.mydepartment or even com.mydomain.mydepartment.mysubdepartment. The goal here is to use an ID that uniquely identifies the entity that is creating the lessons. We also specify a library ID. We do this because it's possible that you or your organization will have multiple lesson libraries. Perhaps you will give some people access to one library and give others access to others. Your library ID should start with your provider ID. And if you only have one library, that may be all you need, as is the case here. If you want to have multiple libraries, simply add a name for the library, like this, or this. The lesson ID should start with the ID for the library that the lesson is a part of. Then we specify the languages that are used in the lesson. First, we specify the native language, in this case English, then the target language, which is Mandarin Chinese. The codes that we use to identify the languages are called ISO 639-3 codes. You can Google this to get more information about the ISO 639-3 specification. Next, we specify the lesson's name. Note that the lesson ID contains only lowercase letters, periods, and underscores. The next 2 lines specify the lesson's languages in a somewhat more readable format. Next, we specify a level. This should be one of introductory, beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Here we list the roles that are used in our lesson. This lesson just uses 2 roles and calls them A and B. You'll record different voices for the different roles, and you can name them however you like. The names won't appear in Language Mentor unless you choose to credit your voice talent in the credits section of the app. The release type should be specified as alpha, beta, or production. Alpha and beta are used while we're testing the lesson, Production is used when a lesson is published to the world. So that's the header. While this may seem complicated, don't let it intimidate you. Once you've created your first header, you can simply copy and modify it for other lessons. For example, I can take this header and change the lesson name, the lesson ID, and the lesson level. And now I've created a new header for my next lesson. We add roll lines to the script to indicate which voices are used for which chunks. In this case, we have two different roles for two different chunks. Obviously, in a real script, a given role may have several chunks in succession. Role lines should simply have the role's name followed by a colon. Now let's look at the chunks. In this case, we're working with Chinese. Written Chinese doesn't give us much of a clue as to how the words are pronounced. So we also include a line with what's known as pinyin, which makes the pronunciation clear. We wouldn't do this for most languages. Instead, we'd simply provide one line of text in the target language. For example, if this was a Spanish lesson, this chunk might look like this. That's all there is to it. Our script is complete. We should name this file with its lesson ID and an LMLS extension, which stands for Language Mentor Lesson Script. Now we can use the Language Collaborative's Lesson Creator software to create an XML file based on this script, which will look like this. We're not going to explain this XML in detail here, but if you're curious, you can find a full explanation of the XML file format in the articles in the Creating Lessons section of our website. Once we have these two files and two audio files for each of our chunks, note the naming convention for the audio files, chunk number, and language code. We compress the audio files into one zip file. And name it with the lesson ID. And now our lesson is ready to be deployed to the server. Specifically, we'll copy the XML and zip files to the server using an FTP client like, for example, FileZilla. As we explained when we began, this video provides a fairly quick overview of the process that we use when we create lessons for Language Mentor. We've now done this. Just so you know, here are a few of the things that we've skipped over. First of all, of course, you have to write the lessons and translate them. You also have to obtain audio recordings and edit them. And, by the way, doing this well isn't a trivial endeavor. There's a lot to know about audio recording and editing. You'll also need to set up your server so that it's ready to receive your lesson files. This is a fairly simple process for a technically inclined person. We explain it in detail in the articles in the Creating Lessons section of our website. Finally, we encourage you to add credits information to your lessons so that those who have contributed can get the credit that they deserve. In order to do this, you'll need to get your hands dirty and work directly with XML. For example, XML like this we'll create a credit screen in Language Mentor that looks like this. That's it. Thanks for joining us for this whirlwind tour of the process of creating lessons for Language Mentor.